audience in the room, and so I welcome the audience in the room, and I welcome also the online audience for our informatics colloquium talk of today, which is Arthur Gervais from University College London, where he is a professor in information security, and where he moved to, and where he was previously with Imperial College, together with our now colleague Daniel Kitchewa, who was a colleague with him at that time in London. And Arthur gives a presentation on decentralized finance, which we're very happy to have. And so, Arthur, I give you the floor.
Thanks so much, Josh, for the kind introduction. So today we're going to discuss DeFi attacks, or attacks that are occurring in the decentralized finance space. And the reason I call this now Whitehat hacks as a question mark is because we don't really know what is happening out there. We don't have any ground truth, right? So I'll be speculating to some degree. I'll try to clarify when I speculate, and please take these speculations with a grain of salt, because we obviously aim to have as much ground truth data and reliable sources as possible in our research in general. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of minor extractable value. There are other terms out there that are kind of synonyms for the same concept, like blockchain extractable value, maximum extractable value. There's also the nuanced difference between extractable and extracted value. So extractable should be the entire space of what can we extract in terms of financial revenue, while extracted is what we can measure was extracted based on past blockchain data. So that's why I just have this big bubble here, which encompasses everything, right? And we do not have reliable data to tell us how much this bubble represents. And we have some indications, but they may be off by an order of magnitude or more. So there have been some works out there. The practitioners community has some great dashboards to quantify these volumes, but it's not so clear, right? How much that represents. Yet we have a subset of this MEV, which are so-called attacks. Now, when I pronounce the word attack, I do not have any formal definition of what an attack means. There is no legal clarity of what an attack is and isn't, or whether a market manipulation is in fact an attack, or whether it's manipulation at all. So please take this word attack with a grain of salt. When I use the form attack informally, it's more like there was an event where an entity made a transaction and received a few millions in general of US dollar worth of blockchain tokens at the expense of others. And then this set of other users typically say that's an attack, right? So that's how these transactions get labeled. And so just to give you a rough number, an order of magnitude, so we've been looking into attacks for the last 4 years of the Ethereum and Binance Smart Chain blockchain. We found, I mean, there are more, but we have categorized about 124 attacks, and the order of magnitude of damage or profit, depending on whose side you take, was on the order of $3.2 billion US, right? So that's roughly the order of magnitude. And the practitioners community is typically sharing numbers that are roughly double of that, if you look at other sources. Right. So we have an SOK that will appear at S&P this year. So these 4 years of measurement that I mentioned started here in 2018. We have not started our work in 2018. I want to be clear. We looked at the past blockchain data given a historical note. Until here, April 2022. That's at least the state that this paper was accepted at. We're still updating this data currently for the camera-ready version to have a more updated data set. So this number here may grow even a bit further, right? And as I mentioned, we have the practitioners community. So here there's a dashboard for DeFi Llama. They're reporting roughly 6 billion for a similar time frame. You can see here the activity increased quite a bit, or the monthly sums of the attack volume increased quite a bit in 2022, and so beginning in 2021, 2022. All right, so one thing that I would like to discuss today before we dive a bit deeper into this SOK is how are these attacks, how are these transactions executed? What is the supply chain, so to speak, of how do they reach the miners or validators, and how they're finally enacted in the blockchain? So we have found that 18 out of 181 incidents that we looked at are executed through a Flashbots API. So why would that be the case? Does anybody have an idea why are some of these attacks executed through Flashbots? Yes. Right. So the answer, just for the audience online, is that Flashbots is a private, so-called private relayer, which is communicating directly with validators. So if you send a transaction to the Flashbots API, they promise you to forward that transaction directly to the validators, such that the transaction will not be broadcast in an open peer-to-peer layer network, right? Meaning third parties cannot observe this pending transaction before it is published in a block, before it is executed in the blockchain. So this is a concept of a relayer, and there are various providers nowadays. Flashbots has about 40 to 50% market share still, but there are a variety of these so-called relayers where you can submit transactions to. While I want to note, while they are called private relayers, the transactions aren't really private. You are entrusting these third parties to forward your transaction, and they could profit off of that information, right? But now, so you said these 18 attacks were executed through this private relayer to avoid others seeing that transaction, right? But what's the problem if others can see the attack transaction before it's enacted? What do you think could happen? Yeah.
Others can try to quantify you, replicate your attack, and then pay a bit more transaction fee and get it executed before you, or even take a position based on your attack, maybe, I don't know, detriment the profits that you're gonna make. So you're basically playing your hand open and letting everyone see what you're going to do, and then just play your hand or take position based on it.
Perfect. I mean, that's precisely what could happen. If you publish a transaction that's not yet de facto executed, others can mimic it, they can replicate it, they can try to front run it with a bigger transaction fee to be executed before your transaction, right? And this is most likely why quite a few of these attacks were executed through Flashbots. Just to give you a few examples, these are the attacks that we've seen that were executed. One interesting side effect, however, is that a subset of these, 6 out of these 18, were apparently, and again, we don't have ground truth data, but we manually inspected those cases, and that's what we think happened. 6 were accelerated by arbitrage traders. So can anybody remind us what arbitrage means here in this context, and why would arbitrage happen here on these attacks? So arbitrage is the process of buying and selling an asset on two markets, right? And in order to equilibrate the price on these two markets. Now, imagine an attack is using this liquidity pool here as a source of funds, right? Or maybe the attacker is selling its assets there. And then let's assume the price goes down significantly. So now there's a big delta between two markets, right? So an arbitrageur can see, oh, this transaction will cause a big difference among markets that have the same assets. Now I can perform an arbitrage to synchronize the prices and make a profit on the spread. So the difference between two markets is typically referred to as the spread. Hence, attacks are a very lucrative arbitrage target. And we've seen arbitrage traders earning millions on just on attacks by executing an arbitrage right behind an attack. So it's funny that apparently 6 of these attacks were accelerated by arbitrage traders. So the arbitrage traders have some kind of a bot that observes the transaction, takes it and places an arbitrage behind and executes it, or helps to execute it faster. Which means in turn, the arbitrage traders saw the transactions on the peer-to-peer layer, because only then can they perform arbitrage. So were they complicit? Maybe, right? We don't know. Okay, so just to show you how this works on an architectural level, right? On the peer-to-peer layer, we have here the time axis and this peer-to-peer layer. So let's assume an attacker submits an attack on the peer-to-peer layer, right? So it's being broadcast here. Then at some point, the arbitrageur will detect this transaction, this attack, and he will be able to perform either front running by mimicking or replicating it, right, as was suggested, or by producing an arbitrage right behind the attack. And so this is a possible schema of how the arbitrageur could operate. So he has the option to perform an arbitrage backrunning bundle, so where the attack is executed before the arbitrage, but this is an atomic package. So these two will always execute collectively or fail collectively. And alternatively, the arbitrageur could also broadcast the arbitrage transaction on the peer-to-peer layer, but then the arbitrageur doesn't have any guarantees that it's executed behind, or maybe some other arbitrageur will win behind, right? So this image here, just for your reference, is a symbol for this relayer, such as flashbots. All right, so this is kind of like the possible pipeline of how an attack can be executed on Ethereum. Note that on other blockchains like Binance Smart Chain, Avalanche, and so on, we typically don't have these private relayers, right? So we only have the public network in most cases. Yeah, question?
Since the attack is now on the peer-to-peer network, why is the arbitrator doing an arbitrage but not just directly also like replicating the main attack and then do an arbitrage and bundle them?
So the question for the audience online is, so since in this step 3A, we assume that in step 1, actually, the attack is propagating on the public network, why isn't the adversary taking TXA and TXARP and producing its own TXA plus ARP like together, right? That's kind of the question. My understanding is that this requires substantial programming language tooling that needs to be real time. We're talking, if we're talking about the notion of time here, like the moment between an attacker and an arbitrageur, we're talking, I think, on the order of 100 of milliseconds, which means you would need to detect this transaction TXA. You would need to understand that this is something that you want to replicate or modify. And you would need to find the arbitrage opportunity as well, which in itself takes time. Running algorithms such as Bellman-Ford will take some time. You need to build a matrix, you need to find negative cycles in the path to find arbitrage opportunities. So you do not have that much budget, like your time budget isn't that significant, right? And on top of this, you have a technical complexity of detecting that this is somewhat of a profitable transaction and modifying it in real time. It's just a lot of engineering plus programming language challenges. Yeah.
You said there's this assumption that the arbitrator and the attacker may be colluding because the transactions may be with flashbots, and so how would they know, right? So is there a possibility that flashbots is the arbitrator for someone that you know him?
So the question for the audience online, is there the option or the possibility that flashbots is an arbitrageur player, right? Definitely. I mean, you're giving your private transaction or your not yet public transaction information, your private order flow, so to speak. That's, I think, the financial term. You're giving a private order flow to a third party, and this third party, absent of regulations and legal commitments, can do whatever they would like to do given that data, and profit from it. Yeah, I mean, they should definitely do arbitrage, because that's money that the transaction itself is leaving on the table and was not willing to take. So somebody can take it. Yeah.
But I think, as we also, I can show in quantifying blockchain extractable value, this is quite detectable if the transaction was like relayed privately or was it in the public mental in the first place. And then if it was really privately Flatbots, but then there is a bundle which actually operates on that, and it quite clearly shows that Flatbots did the trade and that would harm their reputation. So yeah, I don't know if this actually happens then, because yeah, quite risky.
There is so the comment from the audience was that there's a lot of implicit trust and reputations that are required in at least the Ethereum system to operate these relayers, and nowadays block builders and block and relayers. So we have even an additional intermediary, so to speak, in the transaction pipeline, and there's a lot of informal trust assumptions that are not laid out properly. This is actually a great source of research, I believe. What could go wrong, right? On that front, and yeah, I think it's still a very experimental setup. That's what I would call it. Yeah. But there are billions of dollars being transacted over these systems today, right? So it's it is quite significant in that regard, at least. All right, so we've seen these options here, right, of how to front run an attack or back run an attack. A front-running bundle would suggest here to modify the transaction and submit your replica or your imitated transaction. We do have an upcoming Unix security paper on showing how to do that, actually, on how to mimic a transaction in real time. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I would like to go into two case studies of how actual attacks were executed. So let's look at the first example. This is from December last year, so a few months old. And what's interesting is the Elastic Swap attack happened on two chains. So there's the Avalanche chain, and there's one transaction on the Avalanche chain, and there are three transactions on the Ethereum chain. So the first transaction on Avalanche, so where the attacker called a smart contract function named Go, succeeded. So this is the logo for a successful execution of a transaction. So the transaction did not revert, it did not consume too much gas or anything, it successfully executed. So it appears that this attack on Avalanche succeeded. And we believe that this is an attacker. But again, we are just looking at on-chain data. There's no ground truth. We cannot discuss with anyone or the attacker. We don't have any context to them. But that's just based on on-chain data. It's what appears. So the attacker executed the attack on Avalanche and extracted some value on that protocol on Avalanche, on Elastic Swap. So it turns out Elastic Swap has a very similar contract on Ethereum as well. So the Elastic Swap have deployments on both Avalanche and on Ethereum. And on Ethereum, the story is a little bit more complex. There are three transactions. There is one transaction here from the attacker. We think it's the attacker that fails. The reason we think that's from the attacker is because it uses the same function name as the successfully executed attack on Avalanche. And we operate so-called spy nodes that connect to many peers in the network so that we can hopefully timestamp a reliable notion of when the transaction is being propagated in the network, because that would allow us to then trace back what happened as we show in this example. And then we have two other transactions, one that succeeds and one that fails. One with the function name not yoink, and one with the function name yoink. And this transaction 2 here is relayed by the BlockX route relayer, which is similar to Flashbots, and built by a specific block builder. But this is kind of like the transaction 2 is the one that executes successfully. And transaction 1 and 3 fail. So does anybody have an idea why transaction 1 and transaction 3 fail here? Yeah.
Just guessing, right? But because it's a Whitehat hacker, I'm just guessing it's kind of a front run that prevents these other.
Very good. Yeah. So the audience answered like there's some of the transactions are sent over the P2P network, some are not, and it appears that transaction 2 is a front running transaction against the transaction 1, and it's precisely what happened. What's also interesting is that the attacker went over a relayer as well as over the public peer-to-peer network, trying to front run the attacker. And if you look at the timestamp between transaction 1 and transaction 3, because those are the ones we can publicly observe, there's only a 250 milliseconds difference that we detect on our side, at least, between the apparent original attacker and the front runner that tries to mimic or replicate the attack and front run the original attack. So what can we conclude from this case study, which is quite intriguing? So we have an attacker that this Whitehat attacker, right? He can speak 2 languages. He can speak yoink and no yoink. So yoink, he uses his yoink smart contract function for transactions on the peer-to-peer layer, and he uses no yoink transactions for going through relayers, right? So you can differentiate between these 2. It appears that he's somewhat of a generalized Whitehat attacker because he's front running in about 250 milliseconds, which is reasonably quick. It's not anywhere close to fast in terms of traditional high frequency trading, which is often, I think people are discussing on the order of nanoseconds. So we're not yet there in blockchains. But still, like we think state of the art that's not bad. The reason we've labeled and the community has labeled the Whitehat hacker as a Whitehat hacker is because this hacker returned the funds. Not all of them, but a good portion of it. So let me elaborate on that. About 523 Ether were vulnerable according to the original attack. The Whitehat hacker took 15% to bribe the relayer. So that's the transaction fee that goes to the validators. And he took 10% for himself. Not bad, no? 44 Ether, depending on the price of like whatever, $1,500, $1,600 each. That's a good bounty. 10% bounty is what we've seen as state of the art nowadays in blockchain security testing. Also, like there are bug bounty platforms out there. If you find a bug in a smart contract, they typically pay you 10% of what could have been stolen from the contract. All right, so that's the first attack. The second attack that I wanted to just briefly touch on is the settled finance from like April last year. There was an exploit causing a few million, I think it was like around $9 million of losses on the settled finance DeFi platform. Settled finance is similar to Curve Finance. It's an exchange of pegged and non-pegged assets. And what's interesting is that shortly after the attack, an apparent Whitehat hacker was able to secure an additional $3.8 million that were still vulnerable. And we have shown before that attackers are not using optimal parameters. They leave money on the table. Sometimes they could have gotten double the amounts. And here again, there were like almost $4 million left in the contract after an attacker exploited the smart contract. So again, if we look at our propagation node, like what happened, right? Can we reconstruct how this attack was executed? This time is much simpler. There are only 2 transactions on Ethereum only, and they both succeed. So there's the original attacker that took about $9 million, and only 24 minutes after, there was this Whitehat hack which took 3.8 million that were still within the contract, that were still vulnerable, which the attacker could have taken. So based on the side channel of knowing that this took 24 minutes, we conclude, and again, we don't have ground truth, but that's what we would conclude based on this evidence, that BlockSec in this case has some kind of manual tooling that would allow to replicate and maybe optimize an attack with these parameters that are there. We've tried to reach out, but we didn't get more technical information from BlockSec at the time. Yeah, attackers, why don't you take like another whatever few hours to optimize your attack? I mean, yes. All right, cool. So these are kind of like the case studies that I want to show on the attack side of how the attacks are executed. And like now zooming out, right, from these 2 cases, let's look just at systematizing attacks in general. So the data set that we've used and that we're still expanding on and that we want to put obviously open in the open for the community to work on is the following. So we have a few attacks in this time frame, both on 2 different chains. We have a few. We looked at a few academic papers as well. What kind of attacks are they investigating? And we also looked at audit reports from auditing companies. And what we came up with is then this giant table, which we don't have to go into the details here, but on a very high level, we have here these academic papers that we try to classify at which system layers are they investigating in terms of attacks, in terms of possible attacks. The audit reports are here. So these are the audit reports from the smart contract consulting companies. And in this column here on the very right, we have the actual attacks that happened. So if you see like something being red here, that simply means this is one of the prevalent causes of attacks, right? So for example, here in this case, this is actually the absence of, so if we go here, this is the absence of coding, logic, or sanity checks is one of the prevalent causes of attacks in this field. And you can see, well, it seems like the academic community is really like looking very much into this area, right? So there's a lot of work going on, but there's not so much work on the DeFi protocol layer here, right? So here it's much more sparse in terms of papers and the works out there. So this is where we probably can do better. There are also very few like attacks that are being investigated on the consensus layer, and we actually didn't find any in real life. It's probably also because it's harder to find evidence that they occur. Like, how do you prove that somebody is doing selfish mining? Yeah, good luck, but I hope somebody will find decent methods of showing that. Okay, so one of the core DeFi issues that we've seen here, right? It's an on-chain oracle manipulation. We will dive into a very specific example later on of how on-chain oracle manipulation can occur, but that's apparently one of the really prevalent sources of attacks. And we went over the pipeline, right? The supply chain pipeline of how an attack is executed. But if you look at an attack lifecycle, there's actually more to it. And in particular, an attacker, before executing an attack, they typically they deploy an attack smart contract that helps them in parameterizing the attack, defining which pools to target, etc. So what happens is we have an opportunity to kind of look at, okay, when a new smart contract is deployed on chain, what is this smart contract gonna do? What capabilities does the smart contract have? And only once the attacker calls the first attack transaction until the last attack transaction, the attack is ongoing, right? So what we can observe is that 56% of the attacks are not executed atomically. By atomic, I mean that these transactions here are potentially 3 or more independent transactions where an intrusion detection system could detect, oh, this is an attack contract. It will target this particular DeFi protocol. Why don't we do something about it instead of just watching what happens, right? Another insight that we found is that depending on what protocol type is being attacked, the yield and bridge protocols here are the ones that represent the biggest percentage of total loss. 22% of the losses fall towards the yield farming and the bridge protocols. And what's interesting, however, there's quite a difference between yield farming and bridge protocols. So here the number of incidents for yield farming is 50, while the incidents for bridge is only 10. So what kind of protocol are you going to attack if you're an attacker, or at least scrutinize if you're an attacker in the future? Bridges, right? Exactly. Like the likelihood of getting a high payout is much higher there, right? At least from historical data. I know past performance doesn't guarantee future profits, but still, right? It appears logical that bridges have a substantial volume here at stake. Okay, very good. So let's take some time to pause. Let's take a little break. I'm joking. We're not taking a break now, but we could pause DeFi protocols. Roughly 50% of the protocols that we have seen have a pause mechanism. You can enact, like there's some admin function or some multi-signature that typically has the authority to just say, stop working, right? Don't continue executing transactions. And we've seen that 25 out of these protocols initiated an emergency pause within the first 6 hours of the attack. Are you happy with that? Do you think that's a good performance? 6 hours is a long time, no? We can optimize the attack and re-execute it if there's still money left within 6 hours. I mean, it's like almost the time to sleep, right, in a day. So it's definitely a long time, and we can do better, right? We should be able to develop intrusion detection tools to really automatically trigger these pause mechanisms. I wonder why these solutions are not out there. They're really needed, and obviously we will have some false positives, and there will be some costs to these mechanisms, but we can defend. There's no reason to observe an attack, an incoming attack, and not do anything. Right? If we can observe an incoming attack, it actually shouldn't happen, right? That should be our mission to defend as best as possible. All right, so one more study we did in the SOK is to compare how similar are attacked contracts and how similar are the attacker contracts. And so we did a very naive bytecode comparison, which I'm sure you can come up with much more sophisticated and probably also stronger similarity schemes. We just took the bytecode, chopped it into n-grams, built some embeddings, and then tried to see how similar are these vectors that we built. And we just found that a lot of the victim contracts, as well as the adversary contracts, are similar. So if an attacker is deploying an attack contract that looks similar to a previous attack contract, why don't we do something, right? Like, why are we just watching what happens in front of our eyes? And this doesn't seem right. So we can detect both, right? We can detect adversarial and vulnerable contracts with a very naive method here, right? That's not sophisticated at all. All right, any questions so far? So one last example that I wanted to go over with you today, that's an actual attack that happened, and it targeted the BZX platform, which is a lending platform. So what you do in a lending platform is you take some collateral, so for example some Ether, you put into a pool, and as a safety guarantee, and then you can take out a loan, which, for example, you can take out some DAI, for example, which is a stable coin, and convert this back to Ether. So you might ask, why would I do that, right? Well, because it can provide leverage, right? Debt is a form of leverage. So instead of just holding onto your Ether, you can get more Ether by taking on debt. So you can have a leverage factor of, for example, 1.5, 1.6 in DeFi as such, right? You can also go higher, but that's typically how on-chain lending works. And this particular attack here, the attacker used about $119 of Ether as gas price and produced about $634,000. But the attacker left quite some money on the table, as I will show a bit later. He could have gotten 1.1 million. So how does this attack work? So this is the very high level picture, but I will go now step by step so that, that we can guide you a little bit of how this works. So the first step in this attack was the attacker taking a flash loan. A flash loan is a loan that you can take for the duration of the execution of this one transaction, right? So all this here is being executed in one single transaction, right? There are many steps, but it's a single transaction. So a flash loan is granted money that you can take during that execution time. And there's no notion of time, really. It's just this execution window, so to speak, where you have access to this capital. You need to pay that back by the end of the transaction plus interests. Otherwise, the entire transaction fails, right? But this is the first step. So we take a flash loan, 7,500 Ether, which is a sizable amount. Then with that Ether, the attacker went onto the Uniswap exchange, and he did a swap, very naive swap. So from Ether to SUS dollar. And by doing this swap of 540 Ether to 92,000 SUSD, the attacker lowered the price on that market. So the price on Uniswap now became, just went down on this particular market. And remember, that's only in the single transaction, right? So that's on Uniswap. Then the attacker took some more Ether, 360, sold it on another exchange, the Kyber exchange. And again, here, the price of SUS dollar to Ether went down. So it seems somebody is dumping some coins, right? That's at least the high level intuition here that we are observing. So why would the attacker do that? Why would he go to exchanges and try to lower the prices of an asset on the exchange? Yeah. To exploit some arbitrage opportunity, right? I mean, actually, he's causing an arbitrage here, right? But there's in this particular case, there was no previous preparation. So this we actually go through the attack from scratch. I didn't hide any details. This is literally the initial steps. But there could be another reason why the attacker is trying to lower the price on these exchanges. Do you have any idea? Yeah.
Python suggests because there are some protocols to exchange or prices on the exchange like Uniswap as their price. The attacker manipulates the price on the exchange, and that probably is going to attack this victim exchange, which uses these prices as their prices. So he's manipulating right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good point. So Uniswap and Kyber are two exchanges that are being used as on-chain price oracle. So if you have a pool of assets that defines the price between the relative price between these two assets, you can use the pool as an oracle, meaning it's an indicator of what is the price between these two assets. And because BZX, it's a lending platform, if you collateralize something and you take something out, the smart contract needs to know the price to know how much you can take out, because otherwise it doesn't know what's your collateral worth, right? Yeah, and here the story starts, right? So the attacker then used synthetics to transact an additional 350,000 ETH into SUSD, and then used all that SUSD as a collateral in the lending platform, and we know that BZX uses the SUSD price here as an indicator. Hence, the attacker could take out almost 6,800 Ether from that platform. So BZX thought that the SUSD to Ether price is this low, and that's why they were happy to give out that much Ether in exchange, right? And this is really the core vulnerability, that the BZX platform used these on-chain oracles to determine how much is this collateral worth that I'm getting, right? Yeah. Okay. And so this is everything. What's left for the attacker? So we discussed the flash loan at the beginning. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
So exactly. So we need to pay back the flash loan at the end, right? So we took, I think we took 7,500, right, at the beginning, plus some interest. I think we can actually ignore the interest, but here this is the Ether that the adversary currently has, right? So we need to discount for 7,500 Ether, and then you have a profit of over 2,500, over 2,300 Ether here, right? That's the profit that the adversary gets from this one single atomic transaction. Sounds great, but he did mess up anyways, right? We mentioned this at the beginning. He could have gotten 1.1 million US dollar instead of 600K. So how can we optimize an attack? So please, if you execute an attack next, right, try to at least apply such a framework. Obviously only in simulation locally, not on the mainnet. So what we can do is we can formulate the DeFi actions in models and then try to use optimizers to find the best parameters for those. And the objective function is the outcome profit, obviously, right? We want to maximize the profit. We can fetch the on-chain states from a historical archive node, for example, if we need to. And we can simulate the attack transaction really at any granularity, right? Whether it's on the top of a block or any intermediate transaction within the block. So specifically for the BZX attack, how could the attacker have conducted this optimization? So we have two conversions. You remember, one on Uniswap, one on Kyber, right, to lower the price. So the parameters we have is how much Ether do we need to provide, P1, how much Ether do we need to provide to Kyber, P2, and we have some kind of a function that gives us the return value, right, that we get. Then we have another parameter 3 here for Ether that we exchange on synthetics. And finally, we need to know how much should we collateralize, how much SUS dollar should we collateralize to borrow as much as possible Ether out of BZX, right? That's our target. So we kind of want to maximize this Ether that we can get out. So then we know the border conditions. We know that we can take X Ether as a flash loan, what we can borrow out, and that's what we can pay back as well. And then we have our objective, right? So we know what we need to maximize, right? This is G of Z. Z being here all these functions minus the flash loan, and that's it. It's very simple. It's an optimization problem. We used SciPy. I think it took less than a minute to optimize once it's formulated. It's not very complicated on a very simple machine, and we validated this by concretely executing at the state right before the attack executes. So can the attacker, right? So please don't leave money on the table. Thank you. Question?
Whitehat could be just a smart way of money laundering. The attacker and the Whitehat hacker were the same time.
thank you so much for insinuating this, because that's what I think so too. So if we go back here to, especially the saddle one, it's very fishy. This one here. If I'm an attacker, I would do the same thing here. Like I would do a suboptimal attack, and then I don't know, get a T, and then do the rest and pay it back and say, hey, I risked some funds. That's exactly what I would do. Yeah. So, and this is the reason why at the beginning of my talk I try to be clear that this is what we think happened, but we don't know, we don't have ground truth whether that's actually the ground truth. So very good for being critical here on that point. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
I think the flash loan attack, there's also this other one, and again, these attacks that you show in your paper, the margin trading attack. And if I remember correctly, you showed that that attack wasn't actually for that vulnerability wasn't actually exploited for 69 days or something. So it just stayed out there, and then the guy did a follow-up attack. And then you showed that optimization approach, like in less than a minute or so, you can find better parameters to like get the maximum output. But I think like this points out to different type of, I would say, exploits that you can do. So for this exploit, like it was out there for 69 days, and then the guy did a suboptimal attack at the end of the day. So there wasn't even competition, and then you couldn't even like find the best input. But for, I don't know, something like finding an arbitrage, or so you have like less than 12 seconds for the block time. So you have to like, I don't run this really efficient algorithm. I think in your profit generating transactions basically so that like the development board or S&P solver in less than 6 seconds, you can actually spot those opportunities and execute them. But then also on the other hand, as we have seen, there are attacks which wasn't like exploited for 70 days and then exploited in a suboptimal way. Yeah, I think this is really interesting because like in blockchains like algorithms, the block time is now even less, like it's 4 seconds. So then it kind of ties you regarding the amount or a detection algorithm that you can run, because that algorithm, like even in your case, requires 6 seconds or 5 seconds. So this then totally changes like the type of attacks that you target. You maybe target like attacks that are spread to multiple blocks or something. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Right. No, thanks so much for the comment. So I think just to summarize also for the audience online, right? So what we can do is like historical forensic of like when did this attack window open, right? And also how much over time, right? Because we can literally look and like if we run such an optimization over time, over blockchain time, we can see by how much the amount varies over time that could have been exploited, because it's not constant, right? These are obviously dynamic systems. And just a note of caution, we mentioned 6 seconds in our paper, but we are not professional arbitrage traders, right? And this was published in, I mean, we worked on this in 2021. The game has changed. So I think professional arbitrage traders nowadays are much more sophisticated than anything that we wrote in this paper, to be fair. And like the game has changed significantly, I would say. So it is a good first step to understand the problem, but it's, I don't think any close to optimal as the professionals would do nowadays. Yeah. So even if you have lower block time intervals, you will have there are enough ways to scale up the search mechanism to find profitable opportunities. Yeah. So if people claim you don't have MEV because you have short block time intervals, that's nonsense. Yeah. Yes. Yes. But,
so you showed a nice selection of attacks. Do you know how often these types of attacks were performed?
yes, so we have, I mean, So here in this table, we have on this column, we have the attacks, right? So these are the 181 attacks that we looked into. And if you ask for the type of attack, then you can, for example, go here to the 12 of the attacks here. So 7% of the attacks. If we go over here, are reentrancy attacks. So we can kind of like, just based on this table, which obviously it has 181 attacks, which is a lot theoretically speaking, but it's not that much as well, right? So I'm not sure this number is super representative for future attacks, but roughly we expect 7% of the attacks to be caused by reentrancy per our manual investigation on these attacks. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's not readable at all. Okay. Yeah, reentrancy. So you don't have to believe me. Yeah, and here we have the 7%. Or yeah. And most of the attacks here, 15%. This is 15%. This is the Oracle on-chain manipulation. This one here. Yeah, the example that we actually went through. So you can design better Oracle mechanisms and so on to prevent these kinds of attacks, but they come with other drawbacks. Yeah, so it's a super exciting field. Yeah, and also very practically relevant. And you can laugh even about people making 600K for executing dumb strategies.
Maybe a question with respect to layer 2 solutions. How do you see how it's gonna behave in the layer 2 solution, basically act of scalability, but basically later the adoption doesn't really reach in the typical format in layer 1, but can be improved with it. Will it open opportunities for MEV or play out?
A great question. So the question for the audience online is, what about layer 2 solutions or layer 2 systems? How would they affect MEV? What I like to think about layer 2 in many cases, in the most simplest context, it's another chain, right? It's just another blockchain. So you will have intra and inter MEV. So meaning you have MEV on the layer 2 itself, as well as cross-chain MEV. And I guess it will just be the same. So there's no, I mean, from a conceptual perspective, I think it will just add this component. However, if you think of, and this is actually something that we also found in the SOK, most of the attacks only consider a system layer in isolation. So for example, just the smart contract layer. But if you think of an adversary who combines these layers here, he does an Eclipse attack, then he does a consensus layer attack like selfish mining, then he does he exploits a reentrancy or Oracle manipulation, right? So if you combine these things, you can create attacks that are likely much more significant in their nature. So layer 2 systems are a bit more vulnerable, I guess, in some cases, depending on the trust assumptions with the base layer. And hence, if you find an issue on the base layer, it may affect the attack capabilities on the layer 2 system, which wouldn't be the case if you have two independent blockchains, right? Yes. MEV actually affects blockchain security. MEV incentivizes miners to fork, right? This miner just got an attack bribe. No, I want this, right? I'm gonna start forking my chain so that I get this, right? So this is kind of the logical mindset. Yeah. We did quantify this for proof of work blockchains, but not for proof of stake so far. Yeah. It's a bit tougher. Security on proof of stake is a bit tougher to quantify. Yeah. Great.
Great. So thanks.
Thank you.